there. So now who am I? I'm Corrine Alita Garrison Smith. For those of you, let's have another show of hands. How many of you are dyed-in-the-wool American Baptists? A few there, not so many. I know that being denominationally loyal is not such a big deal anymore, but I'm a third-generation American Baptist. My dad, my parents went to American Baptist colleges. My brother did. I went to Pepperdine, so I kind of broke the rule. Went to Church of Christ School, but Bethel Seminary. Still not American Baptist. And then, but I grew up going to American Baptist meetings, on a blanket on the floor while my mom was in the women's groups, and then a guild girl, all of those things. When I grew up, I worked for the Holy Donut, for those of you who are really American Baptist International Ministries, for 10 years as the Director of Communications for our missionaries, and it was my job then to raise the mission dollar for them so that they didn't have to. Many of you probably know that has changed. So then I met, when I was in college, two girls who were raised in Ethiopia, Africa, and by Presbyterian missionaries, and they had a really cute brother. If you look at our prayer card, you'll see him. So I fell in love with him, even though he was Presbyterian, and followed him to the mission field, and then we were later commissioned as American Baptist missionaries. But that's my story. So that's who I am. Here in front of you is a PK, so been raised in the church, and now I find myself for the last 20 years in Brazil. My story is not so interesting, but my husband, on the other hand, his story is a little bit more exciting. As I told you, he was born to missionary parents in Ethiopia, so yes, he does speak Amharic and Portuguese and English. And so when he met me, he said, come on down to the front line. His parents, when they were in Ethiopia, they worked for a school there, and they saw all of the kids, the street kids, that were not getting an education. They were there during the famine. They were for the hard times in Ethiopia. They decided to start a school for these street kids. And that's how Hope Unlimited, the organization that we have, was formed. They were working for this boarding school for high school Ethiopian kids, and they hired one of the graduates to be the first teacher, and they had a little hut. Sorry, you don't have the picture of it, but they had a little just kind of shack, and they said to one of the little beggar boys, tell your friends to come next Tuesday because we're going to open a school, but don't tell any of the kids that are thieves that steal things, because if you do, and the clothing starts disappearing off the clothesline for the boarding kids, they're going to close the school down. Nobody was in favor of them starting this school, not the Presbytery. Nobody really wanted to do this. So that Tuesday came, and there were no kids. And they said, Zeldabub, why didn't you tell your friends? And he said, well, you said no thieves. And how is a street kid going to live if he doesn't steal? So they said, you know what, forget that. Just invite anybody who wants an education. And my mother-in-law tells the story that the next week there was a line all the way around the block. And they had 19 chairs. And so my mother-in-law, she took a piece of chalk and she drew it on the wall. And she said, anyone lower than this line, you're too young. Anyone higher than this line, you're too old. We're going to take the kids that are in this age bracket right here, that fall in this height range right here. And so she said that, bless their hearts, there was little kids that were going like this to be lower, and there were ones on their tippy toes trying to be tall enough, and that's how the school was born. And one of the former students of my in-laws became the president of Ethiopia. He was the son of a blind beggarman. And his brother became the ambassador to the United Kingdom. So it just shows what can happen if you give a kid a chance. My in-laws had to leave when the revolution happened in Ethiopia, but they haven't had to raise a penny for the program since. The program is completely run by Ethiopians. They get international funds, but it is completely run by the whole board, everything. And there are now 5,000 kids in the original program, 25,000 kids around the country, and Hope Unlimited, which is called Hope Enterprises in Ethiopia, started the first private university in the entire country in Addis Ababa. They have a program that feeds, we were talking last night, they have a program that because people beg on the streets, so to circumvent that money being used improperly, they sell a booklet of tickets. And so people who are, middle class, people who can afford to give something to people who are begging, they buy this booklet, and when somebody begs, they give them one of those pieces of paper, and that can be taken to a Hope Enterprises feeding station, and they can get a hot lunch or a hot dinner with that piece of paper. So there's a program for prostitution. I'm rambling because I don't have my slides, but I am going to tell you one more story, and this is bragging, but I think you guys are going to enjoy this. So. They wanted to work with just boys because that was the major problem, and it is true that it is harder to work with girls than it is to work with boys. But Mother Teresa, who also had work in Ethiopia, this was before she was really famous, she called my father-in-law one day, and she said, I have these young women that are dying from AIDS, and you need to start a program for tots, for children. And my father-in-law said, oh, no. I have my ministry and my niche. And she said, I don't think you heard me. And he started the program for tots. And then he called her a little bit later and said the same thing about, we need a school for girls. And it was basically the same story. So he obeyed, and he started a school for girls there so he was kind of pushed into starting the programs there. But that's all Ethiopia. So now, flash forward. So my husband comes home, and he was a little bit of a rebellious missionary kid, and but then he saw on the news about the kids being systematically exterminated in Brazil, the street kids. That the program was so out of hand, that there were so many street kids that off-duty police officers, do you remember this in the 90s, ever reading about this? It was on 60 Minutes, it was on the news a lot, but there were so many kids that the business people would hire off-duty police officers to go out and gun them down and kill them like they were varmints or something that needed to be exterminated. And my husband, who had had this experience in Ethiopia of seeing what could happen, the transformation of street kids, he said to his dad, I want to go and I want to do something to help these street kids. Part of the reason that he felt that way was because he had an exchange student. Who was it? Keith and Norma have the exchange student. They had an exchange student, the Smiths, my in-laws, in their home when they lived in San Francisco, that was Brazilian. But he was from the elite side of the Brazilian side of the tracks, right? He was from the elite side. And, but it gave my husband, the Lord was preparing his heart, because it gave him an affinity, a feel for Brazil. So when it was on the news, it was interesting to him, and he says, I can do something about this. I want to go do something about that. So his dad, who, my husband had been kind of rebellious, his dad saw this transformation and said, okay, let's go. And so he had frequent flyer miles on Pan Am Airlines, and so they got on an airplane, and they decided to go visit that they would start by visiting this exchange student in Campinas. So while they were on the plane, now remember, this was in the late 80s, okay? So his dad said, I'm going to go sit in the back where there's some seats where I can stretch out, so 3 across. So he went and laid down in the back, and pretty soon, this young guy, who I have a picture of, but you could just pretend you know what he looks like. He comes up and he taps Phil on the shoulder and he says, it was a young guy, same age as Phil, do you mind if I sit here? Because while I was in the bathroom, some old man took my seat. Now you tell me this isn't something from the Lord, because he says, sure. So they sat down. This is a true story. I have pictures to prove it, okay? So he says, so the two of them start talking, and he says, well, why are you going to Brazil? Well, we want to start a program for street kids. Really? Well, why Campinas? Why aren't you going to Rio or one of the Recife, where there really is the street kid problem? He says, well, we have a friend that was an exchange student. We thought we'd start by visiting him. He says, oh, really? What's his name? Marcos Grip. Marcos? Well, his twin brother, Flavio, is my tennis partner. We went to the same private school, because these were both two very elite families. And he says, my dad holds the deed to an orphanage that has been closed for many, many years. Maybe there's a match. And so they got off the plane. They had a churrasco, which is a Brazilian barbecue, that weekend. And my husband, who was in his mid-20s at that point, ended that barbecue holding the deed to an orphanage. And it's huge. Someday I'll show you the pictures of this orphanage. But it needed about $1 million worth of work to get it up and running. And so his dad said, well, I guess I'll go home and raise money. And and Phil said, I guess I'm a missionary. That's all the missionary training he had. And he said, okay, well, I guess I'm here. And I think that God was worried about his faith, because 3 months later, Pan Am Airlines went bankrupt, and he had no ticket home. So he had to stay. So that was kind of what cemented his journey, because he didn't have a ticket home. But the first money, the first $500,000 actually came from our partners in Ethiopia to start that ministry. So it really has been a global project. And it's hard to explain. I think I kind of left dangling there the part about how the kids were being exterminated. There's nothing, obviously, that can justify that. But what was happening was, because there was a problem, there was a lot of very well-meaning nonprofit organizations from the United States and Europe that had gone in and put pressure on Brazil to reform their orphanages because of all of the bad things that were happening in the orphanages. But what happened is the laws were changed to the point that a little kid could do something wrong and not be prosecuted for it. So you could, rob a store and be out the next day. And there were so many kids that were unwanted that they would get band together in little groups, but they would break the window of a bakery and go in and just ransack the bakery. And there was nothing that could be done about it because they were minors, and so they couldn't be prosecuted. And so imagine the anger in those local businesses and the bakeries. And these kids were faceless and dirty and stinky and, would spit at you. They weren't wanted. Nobody wanted them. They weren't getting any love. And so it was just an impossible situation. And so and the most famous maybe you heard about it, the most famous of those executions, would you say, was called Candelaria. And there were, I think it was 19 kids that were asleep on the church steps in Rio when the police officers gunned them down. And so that was the climate and the situation that we walked into when we started Hope Unlimited. And the first kids, none of them stayed. And that's where the theme of this talk is when love is not enough. My husband would talk to these kids, and he went out on the streets, and he would, Golbery, one of our boys, I was not planning on telling this story, but Golbery, one of our boys, he actually won an award from Rotary for a ministry project he started. But his story is this, and it kind of paints the picture of what would happen. He lived in a plaza, and he said this young man who didn't speak very good Portuguese at all, one day took him and his buddies to eat breakfast in a restaurant. And it thrilled him because they had dignity. And he was sitting in the restaurant where he used to eat out of the trash can in the back. And so he's eyeing all of the people that, the servers and everybody that usually were kicking at him and saying, get out of here, because he was being served by them now. Well, of course, it was Philip when he first got down there, and he was trying to find his way and trying to make connections with street kids. So you fast forward a little bit farther, and Golbery was hanging around with these kids, hiding from the police who were executing them, and they robbed a bus. And at that point, he was with older kids. And they would go into buses and they would just systematically rob everybody that was sitting on the bus. But in this particular event, the bus driver was killed. And the kids, the older kids, said, "You take the rap because you're younger and you won't go to jail." Fortunately for Gobri, the people that were on the bus said, no, it was not him. And he was sent to us. But he tells a story about how he ate our food and he took our clothes and he left owing us nothing with a great feeling of satisfaction, like he had won the system, and went back out to the street because he didn't want to, he wanted to be in control. When you're a kid that's a street kid, you have always, your frontal cortex doesn't work the same as ours, and you're always in an adrenaline, and it's a fight or flight system, and so you're always trying to, love is just a tool where you manipulate somebody to do what you want them to do for you. And so love is not enough. You have to restore structure and a moral authority for these kids to be able to respond. So you have to give them order. And so he had this reaction where he did not want to stay, but he was caught again and he was sent to another program, and they said, you need to come. And what day? Do you want him to come and pick you up on Tuesday? He was in a halfway house, and they said, yes, okay. And he says, I said Tuesday, but I was thinking that was a long time away because I had no clue about even the days of the week. Time, a clock, days of the week meant nothing to me. But this time, he had to stay, and he tells the story of Welji, who was our secret weapon in the very beginning. He was a pastor who had been a former police officer. And so he had tough love. He understood discipline, but he had a pastor's heart. And so when he did discipline, he did it with his eyes full of love and compassion. There wasn't the anger and the sternness and the discipline. And the kids responded to that because he had the moral authority. They wanted to please him. And so Phil tells a story about how he said to one kid, that was running away all the time, he pleaded with him. He says, you have a bed, you have food, you have a chance for an education. And the kid ran away. And Welji said, where did Rogério go? And he says, well, I talked to him. He ran away. And Welji took off after him in the car and got Rogério, brought him back, and he never ran away again. And he said, what did you say to him? And he said, I told him to get in the car. And he said, why? And I said, because I told you to. And he got in the car. But he trusted. He had that feeling that he could trust Welji with his future. And so that's the same thing that happened with Gobri. They had a confrontation, and you couldn't do this in the United States anymore, but he held him in a big bear hug, and he squirmed and he squirmed and he squirmed, and finally he just relaxed and just cried and cried and cried. And then he accepted Christ. And we know that if any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. And the old has passed away, and all things become new. Gobri was living on the streets because his brother had killed somebody. It was kind of like the Hatfields and the McCoys, and the two families were fighting, and it wasn't safe at home, and each family member just took off and took care of themselves. So this little kid was on the street. Nobody wanted him. So if you flash forward to today, I'll show you a picture of Gobri, 33 years old, working for the Department of Power and Water, got a beautiful daughter who's 8 years old, best friends with my daughter. Who would have ever thought that his daughter would be good friends with my daughter? Comes over, has Sunday dinner with us all the time, has a home, has a car. His daughter's in private school. He's a new creature. And his daughter and his wife are in a church. They're not on the street. We've broken the generational chain of poverty. And that's what it's all about. We keep telling our kids, we're not doing it for you, we're doing it for your children. And that's when God will say, well done, my good and faithful servant, is if we see that their children are off the streets. Now, it's very weird for me to do all this talking without visual aids, but I will tell you. Yeah, you guys tell me when I'm getting close to the communion time, okay? We'll wrap this up. What I want to tell you now is that we started with one program, but now We have 19 different facilities. We have 1,200 kids on any given day that are in our program. We have vocational training program, but we also have the kids that live with us. The program in Campinas, the original one, is completely run by Brazilians. The one in the north of Brazil, where we are now, we have 300 kids that come during the day for vocational training. There, we only have 35 that live with us, but all of the kids that live with us are there under protective custody because there's a death threat on their life, and it's not safe for them to be in their communities. They've either seen someone, like many times it's a parent that's been murdered, and I do mean many times. It's been a parent that's been murdered, or they've been used as an avionzinho, which means a little airplane, to take drugs from one place to the other when they're younger because of the laws, and they've lost the drugs. Sometimes the drugs was even stolen by the police, and so it's not safe for them to be in their neighborhoods. So my challenge for you today is they have changed the way that they run international ministries, and we do have to come out. And I have to tell you that it's a blessing and a curse, because it's humbling and it's humiliating that we now, is that a bad way to say it? That we now have to raise our own support. And I'm here to challenge you as a church to, and this is what Cheryl had in mind, is to partner with us for you to become one of our churches that is in communion with us and walks with us for the next 15 years or 20 until we retire, or even after we retire in our ministry. And that would also mean you coming down on a work team and seeing the ministry firsthand. I think you guys can do that. There's lots of things that you can do. Writing Valentine's Day cards to our kids, remembering us in your prayers. We have a 30 days of prayer where we ask you to pray for 30 days with us. I know that's a big commitment, but I'm here to challenge you to do that. The one thing about having to raise your own support, that's good, instead of the old model where we did it all together. There was one pot for the ministries. Is I have to tell you, I wouldn't be here today if I didn't have to raise my own support. I would be in Brazil. But I wouldn't have met the Keiths and everybody that I won't met, all the people that I met this morning. Lynn, I can't even, Brent, everybody that I have already met this morning. And I wouldn't start the relationships. And I think that that's why God maybe requires missionaries to do this, because we need your prayer support, and we need to know that we're not in this alone. So we need the body of Christ to be part of this ministry with us. So that is going to be my challenge to you, is for you to be part of our prayer team, for our missionary partnership team, and for Oak Park to consider this ministry in Brazil that is changing lives, your ministry as well. So that is what I will leave you to pray about. And now we will prepare our hearts, I guess, for the Lord's Supper.